So this is a session about going India first or US first. So going India first or US first, you have a lot of perspectives. Incorporation, to revenue, to sales cycle. The possibilities are endless. But particularly for this session, we wanted to have more conversations going on from the audience, more questions, more discussion pointers. And just like how we've named the session Hard Truths, we want to have more hard discussions, if that's okay.
I think
Yeah.
I've had 5 of those questions even since the time I got here.
Oh, okay. Okay. Which was your most interesting question?
Just before walking in, someone asked, are you going to ask us to set up in Delaware? I said, let's cover during this.
Do we have the founder here?
Yeah, he's here.
Oh, okay. That's nice. That's nice. So that is something a lot of founders talk about. 10 years back, if I had to start up, all the advice I got was set up your entity in Delaware. HQ should be US, and then you set up a India entity. But right now, you see a lot of companies, including Whatfix, whose HQ is India or not US, non-US HQ. They are still thriving. They're still making tens and hundreds of millions. So is that something make or break right now in this market? Like setting up your HQ in US?
So I don't think, so there is and there isn't both, right? So it's a question of context. And 10 years back, or the time when I would have started up, I think a lot has changed in the world since then. And since then, because why, let's say a decade back, would a lot of people sitting in my chair would say the same thing that's set up in Delaware, would be for 2, 3 reasons. One, ease of doing business, right? Till even about 5, 6 years back, if you were running a SaaS company, having it incorporated in India, try setting up Stripe for automatic subscription payments. Super hard.
I still find difficulty in credit
It's
card.
still, but it's still solvable, right?
Yeah.
So forget that. So that's just ease of doing business, ease of setting up the business. How hard it was about a decade back to set up a company in India versus how easy it is today, right? Then comes the second lens of, okay, you know that you have ease of doing business. You also need to have access to capital, right? A decade back, you probably had maybe a handful of venture capital firms which would be investing in Indian companies, right? There was no domestic capital that you could tap into. Today, that has changed, right? And I think the third and the biggest driver, or I think the motivation which has spurred this new debate, has been we've now seen enough companies in India go and list and build in public, right? I think 2 top-of-mind examples that many would be aware of would be Traction, Unicommerce. Unicommerce was very recent, right? These are sub $20 million ARR companies, right? They went public. Whereas imagine trying to do a public exit or a listing in the US for anything shy of 250, 300. Near impossible, right? The Unicommerce IPO got oversubscribed by I don't know how many times, like multiples of thousands of times, right? Sub 250, 300 in the US, no analysts were even going to pay attention to what is happening, right? And again, it's a nature, it's somewhat tied back to access to capital. For even the capital that goes into public markets in the US, you are competing against the big ones, the big tech, the FANG, and the big companies already listed. These are companies which are still compounding at 40, 50% year on year. They're growing like crazy. They're stable revenue, and they're large bases, right? How would you compete against that? Whereas when you think of the context of the market locally over here, you're talking about a market which is starved of SaaS-like revenue, right? Recurring revenue. How many companies do you know in India which are actually $1 billion plus market cap, right? So there is a lot of context which has led us to this point where today I would say, depending on nuances, India potentially is at par or favorable in many cases.
What I have observed is there are enough solutions from India and from the US. And all these solutions are good enough to be implemented in companies at any scale. Now, where we face difficulty is when we try and prove ourselves that we are good enough and on par the US products. Is that something that you observed as well?
Yeah, so I think two things, and you took, and you know some of these companies, right, that got built out of India and who have been able to ship globally. So depending on what segment within software you build, there are certain segments where you do need to be the global maxima, right? So let's say if you're going to ask me to, back a company which is building dev tools, infra, data stack, you need to be a global maxima. Because even I, as a developer, as a procurer in the end org that I would have been in the past, I'm not going to subscribe to anything which is not the global maxima, right? Whereas when you think of a lot of other software where customer support, customer service, customer success, customizability, serviceability, all of these things matter a lot and are meaningful to the end buyer experience. I would say as long as you're not doing a shoddy job in comparison to what's the good standard, you have a market, right? So I think it's contextual to those two scenarios, that in certain cases you do need to be the global maximum. There is no denying to that. In other cases, it is not just the product, the way we think of it, which is the only thing which matters to a customer, right? And that's the reason why in the world of enterprise SaaS, you do have so many solutions for the same problem, right? Something works better for someone, something works better for someone else.
I'm going to pause a bit and check if our founders have any questions. And by the way, just for the folks who have recently joined us, this session is about India first or US first. We can discuss anything and everything on fundraise to incorporation to revenue sales cycle. We have a question there.
Yeah, hi. So I have a question about the targeting, for example. So if you're building an SMB SaaS, right, like the global SMB where Freshworks has come out of, where Zoho has become a large business. For SMB first companies, like what's your take? Is it India first or US first as it stands now in 2024?
Yeah, so I'll just break that question down and say, first and foremost, let's never forget that if we are in the business of selling software as a company, the largest market continues to be the US, right? And not by a small factor, right? So even to the question of SMB, the largest market would always be the US, of the States. However, I think today we have reached a point where other geographies have started maturing, right? So India, I would say, is in the early journey of maturing. Southeast Asia is in the early journey of maturing. MENA is in the early journey of maturing. MENA potentially slightly ahead, right? Depending on Middle East versus North Africa. So if you think of markets with that lens, right? Because at the end, if you're building a business, you're trying to solve for your own success, and you want to stack odds in your favor, right? Trying to work with a market which is premature is just going to be super hard. Like, if I had to further add nuance and color to it, in India today, if you're doing SaaS for the financial services world, whether it be enterprise, mid, SMB, you are potentially already in a pretty decently mature market, right? But if you're going to say that, hey, I'm going to do SMB for the typical SMB profile, we are not. And there's a reason for it. Because the buyer who you're trying to sell to does not have a business which makes money or accrues dollars the same way that it happens for a buyer in the US. You cannot expect them to pay for software in a similar manner, right? So SMB, I would say, again, for most markets, so if you had to think of markets and customers, simple thumb rule, US is going to be your largest market.
In this case, can US be interchanged with Singapore, Dubai, and other countries also, or is it just specifically to the US? I asked that in the context of our particular platform, which is a global SaaS platform that we're building. My co-founder is based in Singapore, and we've got a lot of advice of reincorporating in Singapore, right? So does your advice hold good for India and non-India, or is it specific to the US?
Yeah, so when I say the market remains, the largest market remains US, that's sort of absolute, that's US, right? If your question is to do with incorporation, right? I think over there, I don't know the kind of business you're building. As a founder, you should be thinking more ease of business and outcome, right? And if, and I doubt, by the way, that there is there's not a structural solve to do ease of business for Singapore. If there is in your sector, maybe it could be applicable. But from an outcome lens, I don't know if Singapore stacks up, right? Because from an access to capital perspective, you would be less attractive for all the domestic capital in India. You would be less attractive just because of the logistics of doing that. And B, you're nonetheless or none the more attractive in any way for US capital, right? So, and then even if you think outcome backwards, as I said, that potentially we are talking about a market in India where the public market both has depth and appetite to lap up as many businesses. So unless and until there is like a real compelling reason why, in terms of your friction to doing business, that you need to have your top co incorporated in Singapore, I don't see a reason why it should be the case.
So the biggest reason we've got so far is ease of doing business. Supposed to be far, far more easier in Singapore than in India. I mean, we're still exploring that, but that's what we've been told.
Yeah, and maybe, and that's why structurally, and she brought it up earlier, right? A structural solve that a lot of us as founders have realized is India Topco subs wherever we want.
We have one more question. Yeah.
From a trust standpoint, a lot of marketplace businesses, service-based businesses, plan to open up companies in US because your clients will tend to trust more if you're based out of US. How important is that criteria, even if you're giving a great service based out of India, but your laws are still Indian, your contracts are still based in India? Is that a blocker for growing the business?
See, anything which goes beyond selling purest bits, which is software, anything which goes beyond purest software selling, you would always prefer to ensure that you build that trust, and that typically stems from proximity, right? And it's not just proximity. So let's take an example. Let's say if you're doing vertical SaaS. I don't know how many you're familiar. If you're familiar, basically where you go from just being, just a software layer to actually getting into payments, fintech, so much more. In a case like that, you would have to be locally present and incorporated where you're operating, right? So if you're going to think that you would want to do, it's the same way, right? There is a reason why fintech companies from more than a decade back or so in India are flipping back to India, right? Because these are businesses where eventually the market dynamics and a lot of constraints, a lot of regulation is going to play a role, right? You would have to the better choice would be to actually incorporate in the geography you operate in. I think we were talking more from a lens of pure software, but if it's anything beyond software, you're better off being incorporated where you play.
Thank you.
Hi there. Okay. Just like to second that thought over there. When we operate in US, even if you are kind of marginally entering into the enterprise segment, they ask for some mandates like a W-9 form or any US existence proof. So if at any given point in time, if you want to work in US, wouldn't US first be a must?
US first or having US?
Having US.
So having US is still needed, right? We are talking about a structure where you are India topco and a sub in the US. See, nothing. You can't escape not having a local presence, right? That is not something you can shy away from.
Thanks. From what we've heard, in general, taking money outside India is way harder than bringing it in. And does that complicate the process of setting up a subsidiary or even doing the topco in India and then trying to take that money out to whatever, business development, whatever?
Yeah, so again, it depends on what is the need, right? If the need for the business is that you would have a lot of capital expenditure and majority of deployment of the capital that you raise being in that geography, then is it possible to, is it solvable? Yes, it is structurally solvable, right? So the pain of taking money out, you have transfer pricing and much that you can do. As a topco and a subsidiary outside, there is a lot that you can do, right? Having said that, let's take an example of, let's say you're a infra company and you want to, and your ambition is, and your plans require that you have 40%, 50% of your engineering team in the US, right? Maybe you are better off actually doing the topco in US in that case, right? But I don't know how many of us face that challenge, right? I have not seen enough companies who have that sort of a setup. We are pretty much where the biggest capital expenditure ends up being. And in any of those cases, just having a India topco and a sub outside and doing transfer pricing between the two just works.
I have a question. So we all know how fintech as a market has grown really well in India and Asia Pacific, to a point where to do a single UPI transaction, it takes 32 API calls, and it happens within a second. And it took years for us to build, but we are there right now. Yep. Do you foresee any other vertical growing to that extent in near future?
I think financial services, just because of the big top-down motivation and incent, right, has been one vertical or industry which has reaped the most, right? Be it through public or public plus private. There's just been so much which has happened in that world. And I think it will continue happening there, right? Because we are still a very growing economy, and we have big ambitions. And as we go through that journey, for us, the strengthening our pillars of financial inclusion is the most top priority. I think the only other one, which I think is in the next few short to medium-ish term, going to see similar benefits play out, is going to be everything to do with industrial and manufacturing world, right? I wouldn't be surprised that the same way today you can think of, right now you're talking about incorporation and which market, but like if you're building fintech infra, today India alone is a good enough market, right? I think same way, and someone asked the question about SMBs and in India. I don't know about SMBs, but I think in the world of manufacturing, in the medium term, you should see us becoming a meaningful software market for that part of the world, that industry or that vertical. So I think those two will continue to be the big drivers. Expecting our markets to be, you know, heavy software buyers on the B2B front for everything possible is harder, right? And again, it's harder because it's just the nature of how a P&L stacks up for your customer, right? You could build a large enterprise selling software to gym classes and just those activity centers in the US. That's not no center here has a similar P&L, right? They don't have a business which is as lucrative. Does that mean you can't do anything about it as an entrepreneur? You potentially still can. You'll have to be innovative. You'll have to really think very differently, structure your business very differently. I know a few companies who are trying to go at it, and they're taking a more vertical SaaS-like approach to it instead of just saying, I'll sell a software to do booking, CRM, plus everything, right? So, but yeah, I think finance and industry and manufacturing are going to be the two mainstays. Outside of that, as software buyers, as businesses in India, we're going to be still pretty smaller market.
Another trend that we've seen emerge is going towards software with a service. And so SaaS standalone is no longer working, is what we've seen. Do you think that's the case? And do you think building out of India will be helpful if we go software with a service?
I think, see, building out of India has two distinct advantages. And I personally truly believe in those two advantages, right? I think advantage number one, if you're building anything in the world of dev data infra, right? There are two geographies or two internet economies in the world which have the scale of usage or scale problems, and they're India and China. Like US would be dwarfed in comparison to what engineers over here have to solve for when we have to do a big billion day at Flipkart, right? Or when we have to do live streaming for a cricket match at Hotstar. Those countries haven't even seen the problem, right? China is not a software exporter, right? They don't. They just pretty much, it's a very, very local market, right? And now plus the added geopolitical tension. So I would say on one big advantage for people building software from India is dev data infra. We have a lot of familiarity with at-scale problems, and that context is not there with many people outside. And that can be turned into a product and potentially a big business. I think the second big advantage is anything enterprise SaaS or anything SaaS. Imagine in India today you have roughly 500 plus tech-first companies, right? And not all of them behave like how an American SaaS buyer would. But I would reckon at least 1/3 of them do, right? And these 1/3 are again meaningful scale, demanding customers, have been assimilating and working with big stacks, are active SaaS buyers. You can't get a customer like this if you're building in the US from day zero, right? So in India, you could step out and say, I'm going to solve this particular problem. You could still potentially go to a Jio, an ICICI, a Flipkart, and find your design partner in them, which is not a kind of scale logo you'll get if you were starting up in the US. Now, is that great to build? It's great to build, then that's a great cold start for you. Can you then take that and then build your GTM motion for the larger US market? Because the market can't be here, right? Can you then build and translate it into a GTM motion for a larger US market? If you can, that's a golden opportunity. So I think to your question, those two distinct advantages, and on the services bit, is where the edge comes, right? The biggest edge comes in terms of being able to then go out and anchor your GTM around saying that, hey, we don't just deliver software, and when you buy software from us, you're not going to get, you're surely going to get great support. And every software, and there is this, a friend of mine, Anoop, he told me this. He said, for every dollar spent that an enterprise does in the US to procure SaaS, 1.9 is spent on implementing it, right? Always maintain that context. Now, 2x, roughly 2x of what you sell your software for, your buyer is spending on trying to implement it and make it work, right? That's our advantage. That's the biggest advantage we have, and you know some of the best companies from India have done that, right? So that's a unique, distinct advantage.
Got it. I think we're at the end of the session. We have time for 2 more questions. Oh, we have a question at the end.
Hello, my name is Nishant. I just want to ask, for example, like you are building a SaaS product and you are not able to sell it. So shall you start selling the services as well? And if you sell the services, then your investor can think maybe your product is not the right market fit. So how will you tackle this challenge?
Have you read the book Catch 22?
No.
So, um, should you not? I don't think there is a right or wrong answer, right? Rather, I would almost debate that in the world of AI, you know, about a decade back, we used to call it its SaaS, which is service masquerading as a software, right? And that's how you build AI companies. Now, should you not? I don't think there's a right wrong answer. What's the flip side of it? What's the big con? The big con is it can be a trap, right? It's very hard to, and it can give you a sense of a fake PMF, right? So the fake PMF could be, oh, a lot of the buying or whatever revenue you're doing is primarily because you're doing so much for your customer, which is not repeatable and scalable, right? And which is not how you'll build a SaaS company. So it can be false PMF, but as a founder, what you have to do, you have to do. If you can strike a right balance and get through the cold start by being slightly, you could be 80% services, 20% software, but if you can very quickly flip over to 80% software, 20% services, that's a trick. And if you can, then do it. Otherwise, I don't know. Like I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to it. It's a choice that founders need to make.
Okay, thank you.
Can you raise your hand? Yeah.
Hi. So when you mentioned about starting a cold start with an Indian company where you can build with an enterprise, which you can't do in the US. So at what point do you decide to switch focus to the US market, right? At what is that? Because you can keep going on in the Indian market and it's not as big as a market. So what is that switch?
I would say day zero, right? So, and it's similar vein of the services question. I think, see, as founders, we need to let markets determine in some way, not determine, we need to determine our path, but we need to let markets guide us and direct us into places, right? And even this answer of when to do that switch, if day zero you are also parallelly working and trying to get through customers in the US. So you got the advantage of having a design partner here. You're on that track. That's going well. But you're also continuously calibrating and forming your mental model while this is happening of being in the same room with your US customers. You will find the answer of when to do the switch yourself, right? So I think it should not be confused with saying, do this and then follow through with B, because then it's just going to be a very long gestation period. So you do want to do that from day zero. And that answer of when is potentially going to emerge both from finding PMF over here, and the answer of finding PMF over here is going to be when your buyer like Jio, Flipkart, or ICICI is going to say, oh, are you making money on this or not, right? See, because if I'm a big company buyer and I've invested time with you to get something done for me, I don't want you to die, right? I want you to survive. Your easiest soft answer of finding PMF is going to be when this design partner is going to say, you know what, dude, are you making money? Are you making enough money so that you stay alive? Please, let's get into a long-term contract, right? That's your sign of PMF. And that's typically the point when you want to switch.
Thank you.
One last question, anyone? Okay, I think with that we can close the session. Thank you so much for coming on board, Aakash.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a great audience. Aakash will be here, right? Aakash will be here for a bit, so you can always network with him. Thank you.